Welcome. My name is Shitij Kapur, and this is episode 4 of Life Beyond Coronavirus, The Expert View. Now, we're filming here in Melbourne on the traditional lands of the Kulin Nation, where we are currently celebrating National Reconciliation Week. This week recognizes that the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the original custodians of these lands and waterways, and that their histories with this land date back more than 60,000 years. We pay respect to their elders, past and present, and we look forward to our shared future together. Today, as schools begin to reopen, not just in Australia, but around the world, we ask the experts, are the kids going to be all right? Is it safe for them to go back to school? Is it safe for their teachers? Has the disruption to their education hurt them for the long term? What about their mental health? To look at these and other issues, I'm joined by 3 world-leading experts from the University of Melbourne. Professor Sarath Ranganathan is the Stevenson Chair of Paediatrics and a specialist in pediatric respiratory medicine. Professor Janet Clinton is the Deputy Dean at the Melbourne Graduate School of Education and an internationally renowned expert in education. Professor Pat McGorry is the Executive Director of Orygen and a world leader in youth mental health. So let me turn to you, Sarath. How are the kids doing with COVID?
Well, I think they're safe to go back to school. We don't have much community transmission at the moment, or the testing's shown that. And children have shown to be pretty safe. They don't get infected very often. And when they do, in most cases, they're actually asymptomatic, and they certainly don't have severe disease very often.
All right, so the kids are doing well in terms of health, but we held them back for 2 months or slightly greater than that, and that's had some impact on them and their parents. Janet, how is it going with respect to education?
Well, I think for the most part, our children will be fine. It's been a short period of time and they've had the disruption. There will be some variability, and I think several groups will we'll need to pay more attention to them, and our teachers will need to focus on each individual child to see how they fared.
All right, so the kids are safe from health, variability in educational outcomes we need to watch out for. Pat, what in terms of mental health?
Well, I think on the upside, to support what Janet said, most of the young people will be okay. The young people are resilient, but we've been concerned for quite a long period that the main problem that young people do face in this period of life, especially adolescents and young adults, is this transition to adulthood, and their mental health is at great risk during that period. It's the biggest threat to their education and futures, and it's definitely going to be impacted significantly by the COVID-19
By the COVID,
crisis.
all right. We'll come back and learn about all of these, but Sarath, let me turn to you. Usually in things like flu, children get it more and they spread it around more. So what's happened with COVID? Why is COVID different?
Well, people looking into that, they don't actually know the answer yet. There are lots of theories. I mean, maybe we're missing the virus. Maybe children only shed it for a short period of time and we don't do the testing properly. But I think increasingly we're recognising that children are less infected. There are only 1% of cases in countries where there are vast amounts of the infection. Some of the theories are, for example, that children don't express the receptor ACE2 within their airways to the same degree as adults.
So in other words, in the same household, the virus is coming to them, but it just doesn't seem to take in the lungs as it does in the adults.
I mean, it can occur, but certainly in family studies, often it's not children that the index cases. They're not the people bringing it into the household. They're usually catching off adults.
Right. Now, when children do get the infection, how do they express it?
Well, for the majority, actually, they don't have any symptoms at all. So when they do express it, it's less severe. The same sorts of symptoms, fever and cough, but generally speaking, children are less severely affected. And that's an interesting finding because it may give us some opportunities to look for solutions to improve the health of adults who are more severely affected.
If we understood why children do so. But look, we're heading into winter. Children are going to have lots of coughs and colds, they always do, and a bit of fever. Will a parent be able to tell whether this is COVID or this is the regular fever?
No, very difficult. Some of the symptoms are going to be same from the other respiratory viruses that come along at this time of year. influenza, even the common cold, adenovirus, respiratory syncytial viruses. These cause problems at this time of year. The one thing that's different now to a couple of months ago is that our systems are a better place to be able to deal with it. So the testing is better, the contact tracing is better. I think even when children present with these common respiratory viruses, the health system is going to be able to deal with it better. There's more PPE, for example, for the staff.
That's right.
But unfortunately, we won't be able to tell the difference until the testing shows us that you're not infected with COVID.
So likely what it'll mean for parents is that if a child does develop fever and cough and cold, this time they'll have to think it might be COVID and get tested for that too.
And certainly not send their children to school.
Oh, yes, certainly. Well, we're coming to school. So schools are opening up. They're opening up across the world in varying ways, and not surprisingly, in Australia, they're opening up in varying ways. Some states are all back to school, but Victoria's going back to school in stages. Janet, it's prep and 11 and 12 year. Help me understand, why are we doing it, the youngest and the oldest?
I think this has been a really sensible move, in the sense that what we've been able to do is examine how children cope after a natural disaster, after some disruption. And what we know, that probably the greatest risk is for our youngs, our preps, because they're in that really crucial developmental phase. It's about developing language, their numeracy skills, and those really important protective factors that children develop socially and cognitively. So getting the preps back so that they can continue to learn how to communicate, but also develop those important literacy skills is going to be important. So if you go to the other end, it's equally important, because we've sort of got two groups there, as Pat's pointed out. These are it's a crucial time for adolescents, so they really need to continue to develop their knowledge. We've got many of our adolescents, young adults, doing those really important exams, and that's crucial for their future career. We also have a large group of adolescents who are disengaged in education, dropping out. Now, I'm not saying that those that do drop out, that's for some of them, that might actually be not a bad thing. They'll go on to other careers. But we really have to be careful of those adolescents that disappear.
You're right.
Because staying in education is the best predictor we have of future health and functioning in society.
Now, of course, this is not for long. Soon all of them will be coming back. Give us a sense of how our schools are adapting, because as I look around the world, I think in Wuhan, where it all began, the schools are open again, but you've got to wear a mask, temperature gets taken 3 times a day, and then the other extreme is Sweden, which never closed down its schools. They just practiced a bit of physical distancing, and from what one can tell, not much great harm has come to those schools. So where are we standing in the spectrum from almost extreme precaution, thinning down the schools with staggered classes, to Sweden doing nothing?
So what we're starting to see is that schools in their own context are doing it a little differently, but for most parts we are a little bit more relaxed. Certainly there is a set of principles that Department and certainly Victoria Government have put out, which is parents, for example, aren't allowed on campus. Children they'll have to use sanitation stations, the desks will be apart, there'll be less group work and sitting together, which I think is going to be really hard. So in the classroom, each teacher will do it in their own way, keeping in mind a set of principles of distancing and cleansing, in a sense.
But one wonders that you're bringing these children in this aura of fear into schools. What consequence might it have for them? And perhaps I could turn to Pat at this moment. Pat, what consequence is all of this happening upon the mental health of children and young adults?
Well, I think we need to get some data to actually answer that question. And we have got some data on the slightly older, the young adults, the 18 to 25s.
That's right. You had a slide. Maybe we could pull that up, where you've been talking about the second wave. So tell us about that.
Yeah, well, the second wave, there's some evidence today, actually, that second wave is real, that young people are more severely impacted in terms of increases in distress in the wake of the pandemic.
Right. So we see the slide here, Pat. It's got a blue line, and then it has these huge red lines going up on that. Tell us what these
Well, I'm so
differences-
glad Janet brought up this issue of educational failure, because we've got a real chicken and egg situation there. We already knew that the biggest cause of educational dropout in high school and in university is unrecognised and poorly responded to mental ill health. That's a preventable cause of educational failure. Now we've got this disruption to education. We're seeing probably a greater risk of that, and also a lot more uncertainty about the vocational trajectories of young people, whether employment is going to be possible for them. Youth unemployment always goes up much faster than adult unemployment in a recession. So we're looking down the barrel of a perfect storm here. And we've modelled, this is very preliminary, this modelling that you're seeing here, but it looks like a significant increase, maybe 25-30% increase in need for care for adolescents and young adults as we move through the months and years of this crisis. I mean, the crisis won't be over when the pandemic settles down. We will see a longer-term tail to this, and that will be the thing that really impacts the mental health of young people.
Now, of course, one of the concerns in all of this, and you hinted at this, is that children are asymptomatic, which means they might be carrying the virus, they might be fine, but they might bring it home, they might give it to their teachers or other adults that they deal with. What's the evidence on that?
Well, there is some evidence now, and it's increasing, that children don't play a big role in transmitting it to other people, including teachers. And so there are studies, for example, in Italy, in the town of Vo, community studies that found that no children, in fact, were infected in their community. And similar in Iceland, even when there were populations of adults.
So they were able to test their entire population in a way that we haven't as yet done it.
Yes.
And Vo is, of course, a small little mountain village, I understand, in Italy. And Iceland's a nice population of 300,000 people. They did have coronavirus, but children were spared.
They were spared, and there are other examples of that. You mentioned mountains. There was the case of the child in Aspen who was in contact with 100 or so other people. He had coronavirus and didn't pass that infection on. And then, of course, the studies in Australia themselves, in New South Wales, where children who attended school and were in close contact with 700 other pupils and 127 teachers in some New South Wales schools failed to pass it on as well. So, and again, you mentioned Sweden. There don't seem to be any major school outbreaks.
So this is different because, you see, whenever we think about flu pandemics, one is very worried that even though children don't themselves get sick, they spread it around. You're suggesting from the evidence we have at the moment, that is not a concern with COVID.
Yeah, in flu, children can be super spreaders, but that really doesn't appear to be the case here for COVID.
Okay, so that's good news. But, there are all those pictures one sees of children being kept from their grandparents and, they're waving to them across the screen or a window. How long will that have to continue?
Well, you've seen the mortality statistics for the elderly, and I suppose we really don't want to take any chances at all. 10% mortality for those who are infected at over 80. So I imagine we want to protect our grandparents, and by any means possible. We've seen that the significant proportion of deaths have occurred in care homes.
True. I realize the elderly are vulnerable, but taking away that little hug, which seems to me to be just one of those tenderest of human moments. How long?
Well,
a few months, years, or that's it, done. Children never hug their grandparents anymore.
We don't really have any good antiviral treatments at the moment, and we're still all waiting for vaccinations to appear. There's a lot of them being tested at the moment. I think I saw a statistic there are at least 200 now.
Well, we'll come back to vaccines in a moment, because yes, they will play an important role. But of course, there has been a concern, right or wrong, amongst teachers, because they are truly frontline workers. We often focus on the healthcare workers, but I think increasingly as we get back into schools, in every notion of a frontline worker, teachers are there. Janet, tell me about how the teaching community is perceiving the risk element of it.
I think our teachers, like the rest of us, are aware of some concerns. For most part, what we're hearing is our teachers just really want their children back in their classroom. And you've probably seen over the last couple of days the delight on children's face and the teachers' faces to see their kids back in the classroom that they're working with. So I think they're doing really, really well. But for some, and Pat's pointed this out, there'll be some who will be still anxious, and that might impact on their ability to, work with the kids. The other thing that you might find is that our teachers, as frontline workers, are really going to have to pay attention to how our children are faring. And that means they need resources to support our children's and their own social and emotional development for the children, and their, keeping their own anxiety under control. So our teachers need to be celebrated with the work they're doing at the moment.
They must be. But, usually, let's take an example of one child. If one child in a class has some horrific accident or something that knocks them out for 2 or 3 months and they come back to school, so much preparation goes in, a special teacher to assist them, and there's someone to assist their parents. But that's when it's one child. Now, when every child in the school is doing that, how do you prepare the teachers? How do you prepare the school to in some sense, raise their game to deal with this?
It has been a tremendous job by our teachers and our schools. I just am overwhelmed by the fantastic stories that we're hearing about this preparation. For some teachers, it was really hard, but moving this online learning, getting this blended education going and connecting to children and their families over this last 6 weeks has really been almost an industry that they've switched the classrooms overnight. And so, again, they have to be celebrated. Now they're going to come back into the classroom, and that preparation of, understanding, diagnosing what the kids have been through, where they've got to in terms of learning outcomes and their development, is really going to be yet another phase that our classroom teachers are going to have to work through. And they haven't done this before. They're also considering the social and emotional development of each of the children. This, are the resources available for our teachers to do this? And I think for most part, the departments of education, our schools, our teaching education associations have really been working together to have this really collective impact to support children in this process.
But your important message when you started was that most of them will be all right, but they'll be vulnerable groups.
Yeah.
Can you say a bit more about what you had in mind there?
Well, I think that's our critical factor. So one of the things that we know is there's a good proportion of our society or of our children's population, somewhere 20%, that may have one risk factor. Now, it may be that one risk factor for a child that has meant during this disruption their development, the educational outcomes have been put at risk, and in fact that risk has been exacerbated.
So when you say risk factor, give the rest of us an insight into what did you have in mind?
It could be, from an educational perspective, literacy and numeracy development, for example, if they're at that cusp of really needing to develop and that's been put back, what does that mean for them going forward? It could be their language development, cognitively and socially. All of those could have been really, really disrupted. We do know that some children haven't actually had access or haven't connected to our schools. And we're not quite got all the data yet, but I'm hearing stories in some classrooms where 20% of those children that were considered more vulnerable haven't connected.
So while they were at home, they didn't log on or they didn't engage in the same way.
Yeah.
Now, when we look back to other big disasters and disruptions like this, and of course perhaps the closest we do know are the bushfires in Victoria, where a small subset of children got disrupted. What do we know about the long-term consequences of this?
So if you look at natural disasters in, say, a Western world,
yes.
So let's look at New Zealand, let's look at the US, from Katrina to the Christchurch earthquakes and our bushfires. In actual fact, when you look across our educationally our children actually do incredibly well. So perhaps in a year's time, educationally we mightn't see this. And as Pat's pointed out, our children are actually quite resilient. And this might be a little blip, but their recovery rate is actually quite good for most. There are studies that demonstrate that some children do fall behind, and they're generally those that were vulnerable in the first place, and the risk for them becomes greater. But honestly, across that curve, they all look like they're going to be fine.
Good.
And some cases, even better.
Now, well, that's interesting. And you know, you talked about vulnerable groups, and I was looking at some literature, you know, from previous studies of psychological outcomes of pandemics. That vulnerable group is about 15 to 20% of the population. So, Pat, you talked about the magnitude of it. Your red curve seemed to be going much higher than the blue curve. Even the blue curve was rising, but the red curve is really dramatic. This could mean a huge escalation in need.
Yeah.
At a time when we weren't really satisfied with our mental health care system in any case. And that's why we had the Royal Commission, and that's why the Productivity Commission is looking into this. How are we going to manage?
Well, it's a huge question, and I think the physical health system is in very strong shape under normal conditions, and it ramped up to prepare for the pandemic. We have, as you say, a mental health system and capacity. And I just want to pick up on Janet's theme about teachers. Teachers are incredibly important, and you know, we should celebrate them, as you say. They need a lot more support. A lot of teachers have very great difficulty getting access for the kids in their class that are already vulnerable and struggling. For example, rural and regional schools, often 50 k's away from the nearest headspace. Headspace waiting lists are blown out because of this surge in need. So, you know, the system is really poorly prepared. You know, we have done some good things in Australia, but it's really not at scale. And the teachers in particular don't get the backup that they need.
I mean, it's an interesting point you raise. You know, when the sheer emergency of this was there, almost over a period of 4 weeks, we quadrupled the number of ventilators that
Well,
might
we
be
turned our
available.
country upside down to
Yeah.
deal with this risk.
With
We're not
ventilators.
turning our country upside down to deal with the mental health risks that are actually can be predicted now. So we really need to do that, and we need to do it at a number of levels. And I think the vulnerable group, coming to your point, these kids, especially the adolescents, they are vulnerable to disasters, especially the adolescents. Their outcomes are not as good as the younger kids.
Why do you think that is, Pat? I mean, one generally thinks of adolescents as sort of, you know, sort of free spirits, unencumbered by...
They are the most vulnerable group across the whole lifespan for mental ill health. 50% of them in the transition to adulthood by 30 will have developed a period of poor mental health. 75% of mental ill health appears by the age of 25. It's their main health problem. And the, you know, global mental health is recognising that now and starting to sort of get behind that a lot more. If we want to reduce the burden of disease from mental illness and mental ill health across the whole lifespan, the many decades of adult life, we have to do a much better job with children, with young people and emerging adults. So that's becoming very clear. But have governments got the stomach for that, or the kind of vision to actually do that? Some governments do, and we're getting progress, but it's too little, too late.
So when you say some governments do, which is the country you would point to in the world that you would say is the leader in this?
Well, last night we had a global forum with the World Economic Forum, which our Premier launched. I would say Victoria and Australia are actually doing a really good job here, right. But it's, as I say, it's not to scale yet. We've got a lot more work to do.
Very good. I mean, it would be ideal if we had a vaccine, you know, because for a lot of other childhood and youth disorders, we've been able to figure out vaccines. We don't have a vaccine, but I'll come back for a mental health vaccine, because I'm sure, Pat, you would have. Let me go to the physical vaccines. So where do we stand with vaccines?
Well, I mentioned before, there's almost 200 in development, a number now that have reached human trials.
Right.
But a lot of our hope depends on vaccination. There are very few infections that have been completely eradicated by the introduction of vaccines, smallpox being one. But there is the other elephant in the room, is that whether or not vaccines will actually be accepted by the general population. There are concerns about that. There's a very large burgeoning anti-vaccination community out there.
That's right. I mean, they were more towards the traditional vaccines. Do you think that even pivot towards a pandemic vaccine?
I think that's already happening. A very interesting paper last week which looked at, published in Nature, looking at 100 million Facebook transactions that shows that's the battleground at the moment, which is being won by the anti-vaccination community. Currently, the pro-vaccination lobby is much bigger, obviously, but it seems to operate on the fringes of social media. But because the anti-vaccination lobby is intrinsically involved in things like the health and well-being movement and also conspiracy theories, they're actually operating within the central ground, which is more influential. So some of the modelling suggests that the anti-vaccination lobby may actually be bigger than the pro-vaccination lobby in about a decade's time.
Yeah, I mean, it could, most of us who are pro-vaccination are silent about it. You vaccinate your children, you think you've done your duty, and then you get on with it. But you're quite right, the anti-vaccination lobby feels very strongly about it. It would be very interesting if we did have an effective vaccine, and then not everyone took it. Well, but there is another vaccine, a childhood vaccine, the BCG for tuberculosis, which has been used around the world. And in fact, your institute, the Murdoch Children's Research Institute, is central in launching a worldwide study of it. So tell us about that vaccine and how does that work? Because it's not a coronavirus vaccine.
No, that study is the BRACE study, headed by Professor Nigel Curtis and endorsed by the Director General of the WHO.
WHO, yes, I saw.
And funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. It's now, there are participants in a number of countries, including Holland. So the BCG vaccination is given to about 130 million children worldwide to protect against TB, but it has some off-target effects on the innate immunity. So it can actually protect against other infections, viral infections.
Just like a general purpose vaccine.
Like a sort of boost, a sort of health boost. But it's unproven, so we do need to await the results of these trials. So even if Donald Trump is giving himself BCG, I would urge people not to jump and try and purchase it, because we do need that vaccine for people to protect them against TB.
And we need a trial first, so which is what we're leading from here. So Melbourne's the headquarters of that trial happening all around the world.
We recruited 4,000 healthcare workers in that trial, because that's who it's being targeted for initially.
Right.
And those 4,000 were recruited within a couple of weeks, so there was a lot of interest in it.
And now you're recruiting people all over the world. But how long will one have to wait to find out whether this vaccine protects against corona?
Not long. I think the outcomes are due within about 6 months or so.
Okay. All right. Very good. Well, coming back from that to the schools and how schools will normalize, what do you think will change in schools because of...
I'm hoping that our schools will capture the wonderful work that they've been doing, which has been inviting parents into education and using this blended online work, which I think if this happens, our schools will be at the front line in supporting our children and connecting with our families. So bringing families and children into the schools so parents learn the language of schooling. I think within the school situation, it'll be interesting to see whether what the new normal is, because I don't believe that the schools will go back to the way they were.
Yeah.
And teachers have learned that kids can develop a disposition of learning while they're at home. Parents can understand the language of learning and they can engage really successfully in supporting children's learning. But also we've figured out that teachers have a greater role to play. And if I pick up on what Pat was saying, what's going to be the antidote for this period where we're protecting our kids? I actually want to say it's our teachers in our schools. They are our frontline workers. If children connect in schools and teachers are able to sort of look in the eye of every child, diagnose, intervene, implement and evaluate how they're going, and then connect with all of the other sectors and resources that are out there, our children have a greater chance of building that resilience that they need when they get to adolescence. So I think that's a really important point.
At some level, all of this was true even before COVID happened.
Exactly. It's a really important point you've raised. But I think what's happened in education, our teachers have learned that they can actually do this. They can be the great teacher of numeracy and literacy, but they can also be these great connectors, and connecting with parents, connecting across the various sectors and disciplines, and having that collective impact is what we've needed to do.
That's true, but I dare say that part of it was enabled by the fact that parents who were working 10 hours a day were now at home. So they could devote more time and attention to the children, as was entirely appropriate. But of course, if we just go back to the way work used to be, the abilities of parents to play that role, and thereby the ability of teachers, won't be there. So do you anticipate some change in that?
I think parents as well have learned to engage in education, and I think that will continue. What our schools have pushed in terms of parents is don't be a teacher. Be a facilitator. Don't be that horrible person who's just torturing the children to get their homework done. Walk alongside them and encourage engagement in learning. And in a way, many parents have been doing that, actually enjoyed it. And so I don't know about the rest of you, but I always felt that my parents hated coming to school for parent-teacher night and talking to teachers because the languages were so different and school used to be so scary. In a way, this disruption and this spreading of education into the family life has meant that school and education's become a little bit more inviting.
It has blurred the lines. No,
It has blurred the
It's
lines.
blurred the lines between school and home and work.
Yep.
Yep.
Which is a positive thing
One would think so.
in some cases.
Yes, not a positive thing?
No, it's a positive thing. I just wanted to ask Pat his views on the sort of preschool and earlier child primary school mental health, because I imagine some of the adolescents you're talking about, the vulnerabilities are actually evident or manifest earlier in life, and there are sort of unique challenges for the preschool child whose parent might be working at home and that doesn't understand why that parent isn't paying them attention during the day.
It's a great question, and I think what Janet was talking about, the vulnerabilities, all the vulnerabilities are laid down, or many of them are in earlier childhood, obviously, so prevention is the real focus of that phase of life, and obviously some primary school kids do develop mental health problems that need treatment as well, but it's at a lower level actually, so you've still got time to really do the preventive work, and then the perfect storm really hits when they get into adolescence and emerging adulthood, but definitely that's a very key period to focus on.
So Pat, this preventive work, we're not going to have an injectable vaccine for mental health. What would be the equivalent of some simple, largely scalable intervention? Because the beauty of vaccinations are, it's just one injection, given this, once in your lifetime, simple, and you're done. What would be the simple sorts of things that could be there in the mental health field?
Well, I'm actually reluctant to answer that question. I'll tell you why. Because resilience is a real thing. Janet's referred to it, I've referred to it, but it's a seductive thing. People think they can teach resilience. Resilience, by definition, is actually something that's forged in the kind of crucible of life, in a sense. You have to live to actually develop resilience. You have to face challenges, and there's a movement thinking that somehow you can just make all of this go away by making people more resilient. I'm very sceptical of that. I think there's a lot of victim blaming that goes on with resilience. You assume if the person becomes unwell or struggles that somehow they're not resilient. Some of the most resilient people I've ever seen have been people with significant mental illnesses. So I'm sure you've seen that too. So I think it's a tricky one. You don't want to get rid of the concept because it's a valuable, positive mental health sort of thing to try to nurture and develop in people, especially children. And people are intrinsically resilient. I really believe that. I've seen young people.
All right. So your message is clear that there are no simple vaccinations for mental health coming anytime soon.
I think there is something that we can do. I tend to agree. There isn't a vaccination per se, but if we provide our teachers with support so that they can recognise or diagnose when things are happening and they can connect with the children, with the family, So, building that awareness in our teachers, ensuring our teachers that there are places that they can go. And I think I'm constantly saying is if our education communities and our health communities, our mental health communities can work together, then providing access to children in those early years, because early intervention, as we all know, is the key to success. So our teachers are frontline in this. They diagnose straight off. They see it, they work with the parents. So building their knowledge and skill in that social and emotional area, I think is going to be critical going forward.
I'm definitely on the same wavelength there, Shitij. And I just want to mention there is a program called BU that Beyond Blue have responsible for. Headspace is involved in that too. And that is actually trying to help teachers with this task that Janet's, I don't know how it's going, but the concept is right. But what I see as the big gap is what you just referred to, which is when the teachers have recognised, and teachers are amazing, they know exactly which kids need help and what they really do. They're the frontline people. They don't have options. Teachers are traumatised by it quite often. Many teachers have been exposed to suicide, at least one suicide in their careers of an adolescent, in high school especially, obviously. And they do not get the support. In this state, there are new programs, docs in schools, and allied health. They're starting to be developed and linking into headspaces and so on. But this is the big challenge. That connection between health and education is a crucial one.
It's crucial. And in fact, I can give you an update on BU because University of Melbourne, this is MCRI, and the Melbourne Graduate School are engaged in working up resources to work with our primary school teachers to have a teacher in a school that has developed knowledge and skills so that they can diagnose, and so that there's always a champion within a primary school, and that's being supported and developed as we speak.
Now, look, what you're saying is very logical, and this is our episode 4, and we've had 3 other episodes, and I've heard wonderful experts come and really convince me, at least, about the fact that we need to invest more in X or Y. And I'm just thinking here, we'll need to invest more at the time when the state will be more in debt than it has ever been, and will have less money than it's ever had in recent memory. How are we going to square that? Now, I know that's not your area of expertise, but I am throwing it out there that there'll be an intense competition for public resources. How do we think about that?
I just want to point to one state in India, Kerala.
Yes.
It's not a particularly wealthy state, it's not a particularly wealthy region of the world, and yet it's dealt with coronavirus incredibly well.
That they have, yes.
And so I think that shows the power of good governance in a society that's well educated, values the good social justices and so forth. So I think you can do things very cheaply if you do things correctly. And that means really utilising the expertise that's around. And we've seen this during our own management of coronavirus. There's been a bipartisan governance. There's been an acceptance of the value of healthcare workers and teachers and other educationalists. And there's also been an acceptance of science, the truths. And I think if you put all those things together, you actually do things much more cheaply and efficiently. You do things the appropriate way. So that would be my first starting point. Rather than asking for more and more resources, we can do things much, much cleverly by doing them well.
All right. Your suggestion for limited resources and lots of needs?
I guess I'm thinking if there isn't any funding at all, there isn't anything for schools, what would I be saying to our community? It was trust that our teachers already have fabulous knowledge how to actually work with children and how to work with families, and trust that they are great communicators. So communicating across the sectors so that we're collaborating and working together means that we can do things really, really cheaply. And there is that knowledge and awareness there. And in actual fact, there's tremendous resources that are out there if we can just ensure that our teachers know where to look and who to talk to, which is about communication.
All right.
But trust that they can do it.
All right, so science, communication. Pat, your response to a low resource or low new resource society dealing with these great needs?
I would say it's the perfect time to invest in mental health care because unlike any other area of health and any other non-communicable disease, certainly, the return on investment for investing in mental health care, because of the timing of the life cycle, because prevention in younger children, early intervention for the emerging adults, you will get a return on investment. We have clear evidence of that. And if you don't spend that money, then you will pay for it, many times over in other areas of society, welfare payments, lost productivity, and even things like incarceration rates. So
Right.
it's a
So you're saying prevent that second wave, but Sarath, people have been talking about a third and a fourth wave, and they've been largely talking about the fact that actually our hospital utilization during COVID has gone down. Is that so for the Children's Hospital too?
Yeah, absolutely true.
So people are holding back from going to the hospitals, largely out of fear, and they're not sure what they'll have to do or whether their hospitals are safe. Tell me how that's going to play out, and should parents now feel safe that they should go back to healthcare and doctors as they used to?
Yep, I'd say that's a clear message. People should feel safe to see healthcare workers and attend the hospitals. I think that's very important, particularly for those who have chronic illness. And the evidence there would suggest it's a risk not to do so. So in the UK, for example, when they calculated the excess deaths associated with coronavirus, they found that there were some excess deaths which could not be explained by coronavirus. So presumably, those excess deaths occurred from people not seeking the appropriate medical care.
So I think that's an important message. For the hospitals are safe, come back. Schools are safe, come back. And if people are worried, then I guess they should talk to people in those systems to allay their worries. But at least scientifically, it seems we've done well. It's safe to come back. I wanted to go back a bit in time in history when something rather remarkable was done in children, not necessarily here, but in the UK, when a large number of children were shipped out of London because of the fear that the Germans were going to bomb London, and that the only way to keep children was to snatch them from school and family, put them in trains, and literally send them out to strangers. And that was a formative event in the life of a lot of people, and I've met some of those people. I'm sure you must know some of them, because they're a generation that's still around. How do you think this generation of children, 20 to 30 years from now, might look back at this event?
It's an interesting question. If you consider the impact of displacing children, taking them out of home, we know that that is critical to their development, and it's a memory that can define some of them. What's interesting is, and maybe it's the resilient factor, Pat, even, good or bad if we consider it, some children have just thrived in being taken out, but others just don't recover. And they look back at that time and it defines them. So how do we ensure that this disruption, this pandemic, doesn't define our children going forward as a bad thing? And I think that's going to be a critical factor.
And for them, some it'll inspire them to do great things in society, in medicine, in music, but it's to protect the ones who might be vulnerable, I think is the answer. Look, we're coming to the end of our time. I want to hear your main message from where you sit as you look at this pandemic and the question of, are the kids going to be all right? So, Sarath, what would you say to that question?
It's the time for kids to go back to school and get back on track with their education. I think that the risks of not doing so are greater than the risks of going to school by far.
And this is, of course, a doctor who knows all about COVID and respiratory medicine. Janet, from an educator's point of view.
What I've seen is the development of a new classroom, something that we haven't seen before. It's a new design. It's a new way of educating. The classroom has spread. I think if we could hold on to that and ensure that our children and families are engaged in that really inviting space, it really augurs well for innovation and really a revolution in the way we see education. That's fantastic.
Pat, from your point of view?
In a similar vein, I think we could use this crisis to sort of deinstitutionalise mental health care in a second wave of deinstitutionalisation, actually, with technologies, with more mobile, flexible sort of ways of working, but also building a system to scale and flattening this second curve that we're really anticipating over the coming months and years.
Right. So, many of these great disasters, which seemed disasters at that time, be it the First World War or the Second World War, really changed the world after that. The thing that we take for granted now, public health care in the Western world, came after the Second World War. The growth of universities, all came after the Second World War. So I guess one can only wait and hope for even better things to come out of COVID, now that it seems to be settling for us in Australia. Does anyone want to share a hope they have of how the world will be a better place because of COVID?
Well, the biggest risk for our world is climate change. And I think if we approach that in a similar way that we've tackled COVID, in this country at least,
yes.
We'll do quite well. And that is accepting the science, accept the uncertainty of the science, but coming together to actually solve the problem in a community-spirited way.
That's a very wonderful point, accepting the uncertainty of science. Because usually people have fought the uncertainty of science. They've said, because you don't know for sure, nothing matters. And I think that's a very good advice. Janet, your hope of what comes out of this that's good?
I have to come back to our teachers and the idea of celebrating our teachers. And my hope is that the world recognise the worth of education. And it's as simple as that, because I do feel that the world sits on the shoulders of our teachers.
It does. And you're quite right in saying that, over time, in terms of graduate choices of going into education has sort of slipped against the world of finance or some high-tech professions. But I think this has brought home to everyone what a critical silent role education was playing all along, particularly, school education.
I agree.
And that we just may have missed that. Time to renew it. Pat?
Well, the slogan of COVID-19 has been, we're all in this together.
Yes.
So the world, if it's facing an economic recession, it could be a fork in the road. Are we going to continue with this selfish, individualistic sort of culture that we've been promoting for the last 30, 40 years? Or are we going to go back to a more collectivist approach, which, as you mentioned, was really given a major boost after the Second World War, especially in the UK and Western democracies? We had a society that valued cohesion, valued collectivism. Are we going to go back to that? That would be a wonderful thing. That's my hope.
I mean, I must say, I used the Second World War example, but what was resonating in my head is great things happened. The Marshall Plan, public health care, public universities, but also two warring blocs in the world. So I don't know which way it's going to go, but I think we'll leave it there. It is time to bring this discussion to a close. Please join me in thanking our experts, and let me thank you for your interest. This has been episode 4 of Life Beyond Coronavirus. In our next 2 sessions, we will explore the future of work, the future of the economy, and how we might prevent another pandemic. As always, we're looking for your questions and your suggestions. We encourage you to share your ideas and questions on the University of Melbourne's social media channels, the details of which are on your screen now. We will try and address your suggestions with the expertise and with evidence. Till we see you next time, thank you for joining us.